So, well, waterfall photography today. Most of the waterfall pictures in here, just in full disclosure, are Getty images. I have some waterfall pictures, but I wanted to use a number of stock images to be able to demonstrate certain points. So to begin, one of the most famous waterfall pictures is an Ansel Adams picture. And if you've been to Yosemite, this is Bridalveil Fall. And what I want everybody to do is picture, if you were standing next to Ansel Adams when he was taking this picture, what are you seeing, hearing, and smelling? And what are you feeling? What does this scene sort of evoke in terms of an image and looking at if you had really been standing right there? Anybody?
I think I would be hearing some kind of thundering noise with that water hitting the bottom.
You could smell the moisture in the air.
Yeah, yeah, Dennis, you're right. There's a certain scent of freshness or smell of the water that when you're really near a falls, you get that sort of fresh feeling.
And be feeling the power.
Power, yeah. Yeah.
And feeling really small.
And yeah. And if I was standing next to Ansel Adams, I'd be feeling pretty flustered. but
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting. I'd be like, woohoo! It's a really interesting thing because, you know, Ansel Adams in his day, most of his waterfall photography shows the power, it shows the light, it shows the images, it shows the mist. They're very, very dynamic. And when we talk about decisions to make in terms of how you capture the water, you have to decide which type of style you want to do. And Ansel Adams writes about setting up and being at this waterfall and waiting just for the right moment when the light would come through and light up the mist. And it was a very difficult technology in his day. With our digital cameras and with our camera phones, have come a long way in terms of what we can do and alter that scene and change the emotion that we're trying to communicate with water and the dynamic of water. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where you can do some simple waterfall hikes. And the first one in Bluemont, Virginia, I read about this online. I haven't done it personally, but it's supposed to be a fairly easy hike. That's the one thing about waterfall photography. If you're lugging a lot of camera, sometimes having to get to a waterfall can be a little bit rigorous, because the best place to photograph a waterfall is from below it. It's oftentimes you don't get the full feeling of dynamic feeling of the falls if you're trying to do it above. Cool Spring, and I have never been successful at finding the waterfall at Cool Spring, but there is two little waterfalls at Cool Spring, and the better one, if you're familiar with Cool Spring, is if you follow the path and you go up to where it says River to Ridge Trail and 0.2 miles. If you follow that sign, you may have to forge across some little stepping stones, but there's supposedly a nice waterfall there. Anybody from Clark County, have you found the Cool Spring waterfalls?
I haven't yet, but my friend goes there all the time. I just haven't trucked in with her.
Yeah. So that there is one there. At Lands Run, that's about milepost 9 in Shenandoah National Park. It's an easy 1.3 round trip mile down to a series of falls. And again, it's a little bit tricky because when you get there, you're at the top of the falls. And then on all these waterfall hikes with the camera equipment, you have to be really careful of your footing because usually you've got mud and wet and rocks and things like that. One of the big famous falls near the Big Meadows area is Dark Hollows, and that's a 1.8-mile hike. Again, it's down and then back up. And I would recommend if you're going to do Dark Hollows to do it on a weekday or early in the morning before it gets really, really crowded. And if you continue at Dark Hollows a little bit further, to make it a 4-mile hike, there's Rose River Falls, which are really pretty. They're a cascade of 4 falls together. The one that's most appealing to me and I'm planning to do soon is White Oaks Falls, White Oaks Canyon. If you've ever done that hike from the top of the park, it's a series of falls. But if you go to Syria, Virginia, which is like you go to Sperryville and then you keep following almost to where you would go if you were going to hike Old Rag, you can get to the lower White Oaks Falls. It's an easier walk. It's 2.8 miles and it's really nice falls. And you end up coming out at the beginning, at the bottom of the falls rather than at the top and have to sort of make your way down. I added the Museum of Shenandoah Valley, not because of waterfalls, but because they have a lot of water features by the Japanese tea garden. There's some running water on a wall. There's also some different areas of fountains that we're going to talk about, that even though I'm concentrating on waterfall photography, that you can also do some really fun photography with water fountains and different features. And they definitely have opportunities in Winchester to do that. One of the prettiest falls, especially probably in late May or early June, is to go over to West Virginia. It's an easy ride over to Blackwater Falls, their state park, because the rhododendron and the wild azalea will be all around Blackwater Falls, and it's a really pretty set of falls. And then there's always heading back into Northern Virginia or over on the Maryland side, Great Falls National Park, photographing those falls. But I also want to say that any little creek or stream, you can create the illusion of being at a giant waterfall. And we've got tons of little creeks and streams here. That is a great way of practicing your waterfall photography. So this is a picture that I took, not following any type of really good photography techniques. I was hiking on the Dickey Ridge Trail at the entrance of Shenandoah National Park. It's the little trailhead that is to the right before you get to the visitor center. And there is a really tiny stream, and at certain times of year, this little stream or creek isn't even running. And I had my telephoto lens with me and no tripod, but I sort of slid down in and braced my camera on my knees and took this picture of this little creek and created the illusion that it's giant. But I'm telling you, the water might have been a ½ inch deep, if that. But there is a way to do it. If you get low, you can really play, and it's great practice if you're not up for a big waterfall hike. And so with a small stream, you know, if I went back there with my little tripod and did it right, I could even get a much better picture than I got just sort of hand holding. But to create the illusion of size, I avoided any of the big trees that were around, because if I had the even the trunk of a big tree, you would know that this is really maybe 6 inches wide, this whole stream. Getting low and just really trying to create the illusion that that boulder looks like a boulder, but it's probably a tiny little rock that could even be picked up. And what's really nice too is the moss. But again, this was just, I was out just hiking and looking for birds and said, wow, there's running water. I'm gonna try to create the illusion that I'm at a great big waterfall. So some of the equipment that, if you have equipment, none of this equipment is really necessary, but it can help particularly with waterfall photography. First is a tripod to stabilize your camera, or any other way you can stabilize. Shutter release cable or remote. I just bought a little Bluetooth remote for my cell phone, so I can set the cell phone up and hit it. A wide angle lens is good if you want to get the breadth of the picture for more of a panoramic view, or a telephoto lens, you can get more detail of the rocks, the moss. There's two types of filters that are really handy to use with any type of water, because water is very, very reflective. The first is a polarizing filter, and that's really to reduce glare. And most of them are also, you can have one that's filtered all the way through, or it can be a circular one. And so you could filter the water without filtering as much the trees. You just rotate it around, and it's like a graduated filter that has less strength in the bottom or the top as you rotate it. And that's to take glare off of water. The other is what's called a neutral density filter, and that's to darken the amount of light to allow for you to use a slower shutter speed. It's like putting dark sunglasses in front of your camera. But again, these are just suggestions. You can also do a whole lot with playing with water features and waterfall without having to get real expensive equipment. So the biggest decision that you make with water is, do you want to stop the motion of the water, or do you want to smooth the motion of the water? And these two pictures on this slide show the difference between stopping the motion and smoothing. And the reason why I am pointing this out is that this is a really, this is a decision that is just a matter of technique. And if you look at what Ansel Adams did, when you smooth the water, you create a whole different mood. You create a mood of tranquility, of peace, of ease. And whereas if you stop the motion of the water, you have more of the power of the water. And again, this is the major choice that you make when dealing with water. And there's in-betweens of this too. If you look on the slide on the left, that water's all bubbly and powerful. On the right, it's very smooth. You can also do something in between that where you smooth a little bit of the water action, but you don't take it all the way to that silky look. And this silky look for waterfalls has become really popular in most of the waterfall photography. Again, this is a choice that you make, and what we're going to cover is the techniques of how you can either stop or smooth motion. So I'm going to start by talking about what you would do if you wanted to stop the motion and have that more powerful look, the more realistic look of what water is doing. And I go back to the exposure triangle. So to stop motion, the first priority that you need to do is have a very quick shutter speed. because the longer your shutter is open, the more blur you get. And that's how you get the smooth look. But here, if we want to stop the motion, we need to have a shutter speed of somewhere over 1/1000. And as you stop the motion, you're letting less light in. So your aperture is going to have a shallow or less depth of field. And your sensitivity, your ISO, may need to be at a higher number, more sensitive, more pixely, depending on your camera. Again, looking at the exposure triangle, if we're trying to get this silky smooth look of water, the first priority again is to slow your shutter speed. And the issue with slowing your shutter speed is that your shutter is now going to be open for a very long time, letting in oodles of light. And to compensate for that, what we do is we make our aperture, the little opening in the lens, smaller and smaller, which at the same time will increase your depth of field. So that in the picture with the smooth water, the leaves in the front on the rock, all the way to the back, you have lots of depth of field. The other thing that happens is that your sensitivity is usually at 100 or 200. You go as low or as less sensitive with the image quality, because you're trying to now get rid of light. The whole trick in doing the smooth water flows is to get rid of light so that you can keep your shutter open a very long time to allow for that blurring action. And when your shutter slows down, lots of light's pouring in, your aperture is small, your sensitivity is as low as your camera can go. So going back to what typical settings would be for stopping the motion, your aperture would be, it would be f8. It should be or wider, which means f5.6, f4, 2.8, depending on your camera and depending on how much depth of field. You want to be at f8 or less of an f-stop number, which will open up your aperture and let the light pour in. Your shutter speed needs to be 1/1000 of a second or faster, and you set your ISO to whatever is needed. The most important thing when taking pictures of water is highly reflective. And so you need to check your histogram. And if you have your highlight alerts, because all of the water is going to be on the highlight end of your histogram, whereas the rock and the details are in shadows, all this water is on the right-hand side of the histogram. And you want to make sure that you're not hitting, it's okay to be towards the right-hand side of your histogram, but you don't want to be hitting the far end, and you don't want that water blinking, because if the water's blinking, if you have your highlight alerts on, you will have zero detail in the water. It will have 0 pixels. And what you'll get is nice detail in the rocks, and you'll get white without detail. So if you're overexposing, what you're going to do is increase your shutter speed. If you're underexposing and you have no detail over on the rock, for example, you can increase your ISO. So again, it's the decisions that you're making with the exposure triangle that's the whole key to doing waterfall or water photography. So let's go back to settings now if you're smoothing out the motion of water. So the first thing that I would do is if I want to get this smooth, dreamy effect of water, is I would set my ISO at 100 or 200, depending on how much light's there. But I would probably start at 100. I can start my aperture at f8 or f14, f22. I would keep my going up on my aperture as needed to be able to reduce the amount of light. Your shutter speeds are anywhere from 0.3 of a second to several seconds. It just depends on how much blur you want. But the general way to do this is to start with a 1 second shutter speed. And what you're going to find is that if you have a lot of light there, you're going to push your f-stop up to as high as your lens will let you go. F22, 32, depending on the lens. At 1 second, the reason you're on a tripod is that you tend to have a lot of motion during that 1 second, and you don't want the camera moving. That's why having either a remote or having your mirror locked up if you're mirrored, because even the motion of triggering your shutter can cause a shake in the camera. After you take your test image at 1 second, look at it and say, am I getting the level of blurring that I want? Is it too much blur? If it's too much blur, I increase the shutter speed a little bit. If I want more blur, I would go down from 1 second to 0.3 seconds or whatever way. So slower, more blur, faster, less blur. Again, check your histogram because you do not want the water blinking. If the water's blinking again, even in the blur, you'll get no detail of motion. If you're overexposed, keep pushing that f-stop up. And you may have to, if you're at your lowest ISO, you may have to then say, this is as low as I can go with ISO, so I'm going to have to get, and I push my f-stop all the way up, I may end up not being able to have as much of that slow motion. That's where having a neutral density filter or putting those sunglasses on helps, because if there's sun coming in with your shutter open this long, you can't let a lot of light in. The good news is a lot of waterfalls and water features are in darker areas, or you pick a time of day where you go when there's not a lot of light. If you're underexposed, if you're getting no detail at all, then you can increase your ISO from 100 to 200. So the key to long exposure, which is what this sort of silky effect of water is, stabilize your camera, shoot on an overcast day or in an area that's dark. Dark hollows is called dark hollows because it's usually dark down there, or use that neutral density filter, something to lessen the light. This picture, again, it's a stock image, but it's taken, you can see it at sunset or sunrise. That's it also adds that really nice red tones to the picture. The other problem though is if you are in an area where you're taking a picture of your waterfall and there's leaves blowing or there's people moving, that's going to blur. They'll blur just the same way. And what sometimes I'll do is that I can take a picture of the waterfall if I want it silky, and then I'll take a second picture of the same scene in the same light at regular, not long exposure, and I will use the long exposure for the trees and the leaves, and then I'll go in and as a layer I'll put the it is a lot of work to do that. It's much better to find a day that things aren't moving and shoot around where you've got blowing leaves. Are there any questions about settings, the concept of this choice between making the water realistic or doing this long exposure?
Sharon, I heard a comment once that if you're using a digital camera, you should only use circular polarized filters. Is that true?
I have not heard that, Dennis. I would have to look that up. But the purpose of the circular one is really to show the gradation, to see the difference between the dark and the low. And you know, on our big lenses, like on my 600 lens, there's only one type of filter. There's a limit to the filters that you can put in, because you put your filter in between where you attach it to the camera and the front. But Dennis, I would have to look that up, and I'll ask a couple of people that I know, and I'll get back to you. Other questions about the exposure principles in terms of why the water looks this way when you're doing slow, long exposure versus the realistic, doing the water in a more realistic way, at those trade-offs?
Sharon, do you recommend a variable neutral density or just a fixed one?
Mine are just fixed, mainly because there's so much to think about at the time. I just, you know, and for some reason, I really don't, it may just be that I need to get a pair of clear glasses because I have a polarization in my glasses. So I find myself, even with my circular polarizer, I'll spin it and I don't see the difference. I'm like, and so to me, it adds a whole other complexity, that because I don't do as much landscape as I do wildlife, I go with the fixed neutral density. The other thing that people recommend, if you really want to get into using the filters, is mine are all screw on the front of the lens, and it's a lot easier if you can buy filter packs that have a device where you put on the front of the lens and then you slide the lens in and out, rather than having to try to get it on the front of the lens, because I've had them get stuck on the lens. So one of the things, a trick to bring with you if you putting filters on and off, particularly in the field, is like those little rubber can openers that you can use to grab the edges of the filter and unscrew it, because in the cold or the wet, I've been like, I need to now get this filter off because I don't want it on anymore. It's blocking too much light. The other thing with your neutral density filters is there are different levels, just like with sunglasses. So you can get like a neutral density 4 and then a 6, and you can even stack them together to make it like uber dark. So, you know, this is a whole sort of extra art for that. People who want to do it and like these setups tend to have multiple filters. The polarizing filter does polarize the rays coming at an angle, but it does make a big difference with water, and even being able to see through water sometimes. It will take that glare off the water. And again, the problem I have is sometimes you have to decide, I'm doing primary landscape and I don't want to be using this. I don't, you know, you have to say that bird just flew over and I can't just like zoom my camera up and take a picture because now I've got that filter on it and it's not going to work. So once you're doing this, you've committed to really concentrating on doing your landscape photography. Other questions? Quiet group. All right, so I want to talk about camera phones because all of these settings can be applicable to using your phone. And I recommend, even though I'm going to show a couple of ways you can sort of do water features with your phones, there are some apps that are available, and the amazing thing about apps is that they usually cost like $2.99. So why not? So there's an app called Shutterstop, which is highly recommended but it's Apple only. The other two apps are Apple or Android. And the reason to get these slow shutter speeds is also because if you do use your camera phones a lot, there's supermoons that are coming up this month and night photography that we talked about. You can then change your exposure. You can slow your shutter speeds down on your cameras. It's camera phones. It's worth experimenting with. If you own an Adobe product, there's a Lightroom app for phones, and you can also control a lot of the same elements with the Lightroom app. With any of these apps, you download them and then you give the app permission to be able to access the camera on your phone. Some Android devices, not all of them, have what's called a pro mode, and in the pro mode you can control certain elements and do different type of photography. It's just one of the options, but not all the Androids have them. If it's an older camera with only one fixed camera in the back, you're better off downloading one of the apps. iPhone in live mode has a little trick you can use to do slow shutter speed. Does it work really great? I'll show you an example next. So in this example, I usually dislike live photo mode and dislike when my camera accidentally starts taking pictures in that live mode, which is that concentric circles. This is the same little stream in Dickey Ridge, and on the left is the photo before I applied this live photo technique. Again, it's a camera phone. I think it would come out better if I had used one of the apps, but I was just playing around to see what you could do with what you have on your cameras. So what you have to do is take the original picture in live mode, which is actually takes a series, takes 4 or 5 video frames, and it records sound too. So if your iPhone's ever on live mode, just know when you send somebody a picture, if someone's speaking, if they play it back with the sound, you can hear what they're saying. So there's just something. So the way that you can then change the effect on the picture, again, this is for iPhones only, is that you open up your folder with your live pictures in it, and with the live picture, you sweep your finger up, and then there's a menu that comes up that's called Effects. And the live one will show you a little bit of movement. The loop will loop it around. Bounce is really a crazy little thing. But on the far right, there's long exposure. And again, you could try this with night photography. I don't know if it will work or not, but it's something to experiment with if you're trying to play with water features with your phones. But I highly recommend, if you love using your phone for doing photography, to experiment with the different apps. Some of those long exposure apps are free, but the ones that charge a few dollars tend to have a little bit more technology behind them. The other thing is both with your cameras and with your phones is to play a little bit of video. And I don't know how well the video will show on Zoom, but this is the same little stream in Dickey Ridge. And I recorded it both in regular motion and then in slow motion. And I recommend, if you're using video on your phones, particularly the iPhone, is to pick slow motion, because then you can go back. You can click on the video on your iPhone and it will go into edit mode, and it will show these little lines on the bottom. And that's how far apart the frames are. You can always squish them together and make them run quicker. Again, I sort of like the slow motion if as a video, because you can see the water. The top one is more realistic. It was running that fast, but it's hard to see the detail. So that's just something that, remember that you do have video, and why not run a little bit of video. So the most important thing with trying to capture these different notions of how you want water to look is to practice it. And the easiest way to practice is at home. You can, I don't recommend bringing your camera into the shower, but if you've got an outdoor hose, or if you have outdoor, like a little watering device for your lawn where it's spewing water up, or your faucet in the kitchen sink, just play with the different settings and see, if I want to capture the realism, what settings do I need? If I want to capture drops coming out, because when you have, like, for example, a bird taking a bath, if you want to get those water drops realistically, I would go with a really super fast shutter speed. If I had enough light, I'd use 3200. Same thing with a duck in water that's shaking, or a dog that's shaking. To get water droplets, 3200 is a really good speed. And then as you go down, they're going to distort a little bit. But the best way to sort of know what water is doing is to play with it. And we all have places in our home that we can practice, what effect do we want to have with water and settings. So all of what I'm saying is relevant not just to waterfalls, but it's any water features. What waterfall photography really is understanding the dynamics of this shutter speed, capturing motion, the fact that water is highly reflective and you have to be really careful of your highlights, and then deciding what do you want to do artistically with the water. And so in this picture, the rain on the umbrella on these pictures, again, these are all stock images. On the left is a slower shutter speed. On the bottom, the shutter speed's faster. It's recording the water being less smooth coming off the umbrella. For those of you that are going to the ocean, waves, it's really, really fun to sit there and capture waves realistically and stop that motion, so you get what Cece said about Ansel Adams waterfall, if you get the power of it. But take that same wave if you're sitting there and say, now I'm going to do a dreamy version of it, just to see how it changes the dynamic, how it changes and how you can create art. The same thing with the picture of the boots in the puddle. The realistic's fun, but also it would be sort of fun to do a blurred version of this too, just to see the difference in terms of the dynamics of the picture and what you're doing. And the nice thing about waterfalls and most of these water features, not somebody in a puddle stomping, although if you had said to the child. Can you do it a few times? They probably would. But you can try different settings and say, what do I want to do? Do I want to capture and stop that motion, or do I want to do a creative blur of water? And as I said earlier, the reason that we're talking about going to the Museum of Shenandoah Valley, somebody also mentioned, I think it was CC, that the Burwell Mill in Millwood has a small water crest at the mill race. You can do the same thing with any type of moving water. You don't have to truck down to a waterfall. And again, this is a Getty image, and look at the difference of what this communicates. On the left, this is the World War II memorial, and on the right. And again, it's a choice. Do you want to create this sort of dreamy mystery with the water, or do you want to capture the power of that water? The one on the left, you could never, ever, I don't think, with that much light, it would be really hard to slow that water down. You'd have to have like tons of neutral density filters, and you wouldn't get the detail of the memorial in the background. Doing it at night with low level is a perfect example of combining night photography and a water feature. And I'm 100% sure somebody did this. They were on a tripod, because this is a really slow exposure, but really nicely done. There wasn't probably a whole lot of wind, because if there was wind, you'd see a little movement in those trees in the back. And also that central water would be not as tight as it is in that picture. But you know, the opportunity to think about, do you have a place you can go to do water features at night that are lit up? That's really super fun. And if you notice, and I just noticed it now, if you really peek into the people on the right-hand side of the night one, there is a woman. Some people weren't moving, like the people sitting on that bench back there are pretty clear, but there's a woman who is in sort of turquoise, if you look in the right, and she looks like a ghost. And so what happens when you do slow motion is you can get ghost people too, which you can play with. You can sort of add that to your sort of night photography. But I don't know if everybody can see that woman, and I don't know if my cursor shows, but she's like in the right hand side. There's a turquoise sort of, you can see her feet in women, but of the woman in the background. But that's what happens, and I didn't notice it because your eye is so drawn to the middle and to the night photography. But again, the reason that we can get the nice, smooth, silky effect of the water feature at night is because we don't have a whole lot of light. It allows the shutter to be open longer. It smooths the water. During the day, quick shutter speed, and it's freezing the motion of the fountain. So before we end on different water, and we're going to critique some pictures because people really liked doing that last time, just to get some learning, I want to talk about reflections, because reflections are also a really fun thing to do with water. And if you do reflections, if you think about all the times you've been on a lake and early in the morning, how still everything is, and water will start to move and wind will come up as it heats up. So the best time to do reflections is early in the morning before the sun is creating motion, and you've got that really nice golden hour light. If you want a mirrored reflection, find a place that's sheltered from the wind as best you can. Your aperture setting for reflections is that the more depth of field you have, or the narrower your aperture is. it will create more detail in the reflection, but that means you're letting less light in, which means a slower shutter speed. So you have to balance that. That's why you don't want a whole lot of wind. If you want to get more of an abstract feel, use a shallow depth of field, and that will create more abstraction in your reflections. When you have reflections that are bright, they can create more of that gentle, peaceful feeling of being on that lake. You can picture being there and hearing the birds and just, having that cup of coffee or tea and looking out as the mist is rising from the lake. And then dark reflections oftentimes will create more of a mystique. And again, we started by talking about what Ansel Adams' Waterfall created in terms of a feeling. So as you're looking at it, what feeling do you want to express as you're putting this together? And one trick, if you've got a lot of wind, that if you decrease your shutter speed, long as the trees aren't blowing too much, it can smooth water out even when you're doing a reflection. So again, if you want to smooth water, a longer shutter speed will blur water. If you're having a blur in your reflection anyhow, you can experiment with trying to increase your shutter speed to create a little bit more. It will create a feeling of movement of that water rather than just the ripples. So the other thing that we saw in Ansel Adams' photograph is the mist. And he purposely, when he talked about doing that photo, he was really wanting not just the waterfall itself, but he wanted that diagonal mist that was coming across. And the trick with mist and fog, and we've said this before in other presentations, is that it's the same as what happens when you photograph snow. Is your camera wants to turn everything into neutral 18% gray. So if you want to have any white coming through your mist or your fog, you have to be one stop overexposed. And this can be true on your camera phones too by brightening up the exposure. And so what happens is if you're in aperture priority or if you're in shutter priority, your camera will automatically set things so that, like in this picture of the back of the camera, your exposure will be right in the middle at 0. If you're not using manual exposure, if you're using one of the priority exposures, there's an EV button somewhere on your camera. And what you do is you go to +1 and try it. If you're in manual exposure, just make sure that rather than the indicator being right at 0, make sure that you've set your settings so that this little white indicator is at +1, and try it. And then make sure you're not overexposing with your histogram or your blinkies. But the key to mist and fog and making it dynamic and having a feeling and having detail is a tiny bit of overexposure. If not, this scene would be gray on gray and you wouldn't get that detail. So the last area we're going to talk about is composition, because I think waterfall photography can be challenging from a compositional standpoint, mainly because a lot of times you're just stuck being where you are. And so you have to pay very careful attention to what are your leading lines going in? How is that water flowing? Is it, when you look at that picture, will the flow of the water and what you have in it, Will it naturally take the eye on the right journey? The other thing is, how much other distracting elements do you have? There's something about simplicity in framing that is also very important. I'm just waiting for my 11 o'clock nuthatch clock to, so sorry about that. If you can, you want to include a non-distracting foreground element because that will add depth to your scene. A splash of color, like again, in this stock photography, perfect color standing in front. Again, this doesn't follow your typical composition rules. She's middle, and even when the picture was full, she's smack dab in the middle. So it's okay to break that rule of thirds if that's what the picture calls for. And it's just sort of perfect, her arms versus the way that the water is cascading down. So having somebody in a colorful jacket, a red leaf, sunrise, sunset will add some pictures because usually waterfalls are pretty monochrome. They're usually a lot of black and white. And so looking for those mossy rocks and saying, can I get that extra texture in, really does help. And if you've gone to the whole effort of hiking down and doing a waterfall hike to take pictures, do some detail pictures too. Don't just take pictures of the waterfall and leave. Say, I'm just going to take some time and really zoom in on the mossy rocks and not care as much about the whole scene. The texture in the ledges near the waterfall is really beautiful, or the light is shining on the mica of the geology, and I'm just going to do a really zoom in close up on those rock features. So don't ignore all the little beautiful things. Sometimes fall leaves look really beautiful in the wet. So look around you and say, have I really exploited all of the opportunities to take pictures in this setting before packing up and hiking back out of the trail? So what we're going to do now, like we did before, and this requires everybody's participation, is look at some of these stock images that I pulled and talk about what you're seeing in them and what learnings that we have if you were there doing this picture of the falls. So let's look at this first one. What do we think's happening with this picture?
Lights are blowing out and fast shutter speed.
Yeah,
Too fast.
Go ahead. So Dennis is absolutely right. If you look at this sort of midsection, there's zero detail. When you blow your highlights, there's literally no data. What happens when you print that picture is it's printing whatever the paper is behind it. There's no information.
The other thing is the contrast. It's really dark and it's really bright. Be almost better to maybe take two pictures and then stack them.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the wrong time of day probably to have tried to take this picture. There's a ton of light. You can see how much light there is at the top. What do we see from composition?
Your eye really comes to that one black spot in the lower right.
Yeah, I don't know what these are. It looks almost like a metal can or something, or a log.
Yeah, my eye goes to the right, to all the whites, totally imbalanced.
Yep. Yeah, and then the other problem with this one is you've got the vines hanging right down over the sort of most interesting part of the picture. And so it is really tricky with waterfalls, but maybe if you could really carefully walk over to the left and shoot it towards the falls, you might have been a little bit under those vines, shooting it up. But in full disclosure, the little picture of the creek at Dickey Ridge that I took out a bunch of sticks that were really annoying to me in post-production. Usually waterfall areas are messy. There's a lot going on in them too. So definitely check your blinkies, check your highlight alerts, because water is incredibly reflective and you can blow your highlights really, really easily. Okay, second picture. What do we think?
I don't see it yet.
Right.
Oh, okay.
There. Hmm. I think that the waterfalls lost their detail. And then there's this big rock right there in the middle of it. Just draws your eye right to that rock.
You didn't follow the rule of thirds, and I think you could do that with this one.
This one's a really, this one's difficult. Definitely the waterfall on the left is you've lost, you're overexposed. Again, if you clip your highlights, you will have no detail. The other thing is that, I look at it and here's one leading line and here's another. And so my head's like on a swivel going, should I look left? Should I look right? And if you were there, I think you have to, you get excited and you say, well, this is a really cool waterfall because two of them are coming together, but it's a really confusing, it's really confusing visually. And so, and part of the problem is you've got this, again, the leading line on the right, you've got water coming down this way. I don't know if you could walk further and shoot the leading line to the left-hand waterfall, but then they're merging. And sure, you get down there and you say, this is really sort of neat effect, but how do I communicate it in a picture? And maybe using a telephoto lens and doing a little bit more detail on the one on the right, maybe trying to shoot it even further back might have been more attractive. But Missy's right, the foreground element is sort of, it's bigger, it looks bigger than the falls themselves. It's just a confusing picture. And I'm sure if you were physically there, it's pretty much, it would be really fun. Or maybe even a detailed picture inside this little rock area right here, on the left-hand one, just doing the top. So if you get into a situation and you yourself don't know, should I look left? Should I look right? What should I do with this scene? Start to decompose it and only take parts of it. Maybe just take the trees and the right-hand one, but, and I'm sure somebody took a lot of time to try to put this together and set it up, but it's not working. And there's no way even, you know, I was trying to even play, could I crop it and make something of it? And I couldn't. And the light is all wonky too. Again, wrong time of day for taking this picture, way too bright. The water coming out of the left-hand one is sort of nice on the left, but on the right, it's overexposed, but the bottom isn't overexposed on the right one. The one on the left, it's exposed okay for the very top, but then the right's overexposed. So it's sort of, you know, I'm sure somebody was thrilled to be there, but it's not working. It's not working as a picture. All right, I'm going to the next one, but I'll wait until someone tells me they can see it, because I know there's a lag. Missy, can you see the new one?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Uh-uh.
The next one is more of a something you might see in Costa Rica.
There it is.
Okay.
That's beautiful.
Mm. Anything you do differently?
I'm not sure how I do it.
Anyone?
Left-hand corner is really bright and takes my eye to that.
Yeah, Cece, I was sort of curious. I almost as a viewer want to walk to the left and shoot it from the left, so the terraces are also a leading line in.
Yeah.
Because the terrace on the right is your leading line is this way. You know, again, you're going from the bottom right, you're leading up to the palms, and then you've got the terraces coming this way. And again, you know, probably a beautiful place to be. I'm not sure that the very top adds very much to it where the bright is, but if I could safely sort of move over and take it on that angle, it might have been, it might have given my eye the pathway up to the falls itself.
And I wonder, even in the picture, obviously they were trying to slow the water, but in this one, I wonder if the thought was get the continuation of the water that's coming down to the right to complete it. I would do the same as you.
Yeah.
said, but
Yeah.
I just wonder if that wasn't the thought on both of them.
Yeah. See.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, and I don't know if you're seeing it yet, but when you look at my left-hand arrow, to me, I would want to try to frame it so that I'm using that leading line as best I could. And that's what when you get to a scene, you need to keep sort of walking and moving and thinking. The other thing that might have been a good thing to do here is to get lower. And again, you know, shooting it a little bit lower and up so that you sort of stop your image at the top of the falls with a lower angle of the camera. And that's what you know, when I'm doing flowers, I'm doing anything, I'm sort of moving around saying, well, what's in the background? What if I move here? And, you know, sometimes I'll say, you know, I've tried and tried and tried, I just can't do it. But I'm sort of, as Cece said, I'm sort of curious as to what's going on left and up in this picture.
Yeah, I'm distracted by that green branch coming in from the left top corner. If you were lower, that may not be in the shot.
Exactly, exactly.
And there's
You know,
more-
so a lot of times we don't think, what if I shoot higher and down? What if I shoot lower and up? And just taking the time to really look. So I have another one that may be on its way to you all from my extremely slow internet here.
There are two bursts of light, one in the center and one to the left. So if you got down lower, you could eliminate those maybe.
Yep, yep. So has the, not yet?
Yeah.
There's a lot to look at in this photo.
Exactly. So, you know, the, if you think about it, and what I was saying before, the ferns along this wall on the right are really, really pretty. You know, I would almost do a whole little photography just with these little tiny ferns and the rocks and the water dripping down. That might be a really cool little tiny photo. And but if look closely at the rocks behind the falls, do you see, is everybody seeing that the tip of the rock's blue and the middle of the rock isn't? Somebody did something in post-production, I think, and because in post-production you can pick like certain colors or certain luminance and then say change it. And I think what they did is they wanted the water to be blue, but that water isn't blue. I'd be shocked if that water in reality was that blue. Look at how it's hitting the pool in the bottom. The pool in the bottom's green, but this water looks like somebody took food coloring dye, squeezed it into the water.
Right.
Because it's not even even. It's like up top, there's some gaps where the blue didn't hit. And I didn't notice that until just now. I'm like,
Right.
what the heck's going on with these blue rocks down there too?
It's I look at it, it's really super artificial looking, and also in the middle of the picture too, there's rocks that have a lot of yellow.
Yeah.
Which is really distracting as well.
Yeah. So, and you're right, Laurie, they stop on the left. So whatever they did in post-production with this, they just decided that they wanted this like swath of saturation and changing colors, but we won't do the rest of it because they wanted the eye to go sort of into the water. So this is an example of something don't do in post-production. But, you know, again, I think the most interesting thing about this whole picture to me are these tiny little ferns that are along the rocks. To me, that's more appealing to me than the waterfalls. They just look like somebody's decided to play with the colors. But those ferns are beautiful and the rocks are beautiful. And so don't forget when you're down there to see the whole environment and get those tiny features as well. So I have put up another picture, but it probably will be a little lag before it gets to you. And the reason I like doing these critiques is to get you to think about, if you were in the situation, what would you do? Where would you move? How would you put things together? And the next one looks like it might have been even taken from near here. There's some wild azalea and
It's up.
it's up. Yay. Okay, so
It doesn't need that fence in the picture.
yeah, the fence has to go.
Again, but move over to the left, get more of those falls that are on the right without the fence in front of it.
Yeah, and Cece, you're right. I don't think the top's doing much for it, and it's got that distortion roll that a wide angle lens will do. You know, so and it looks a little wonky to me. It looks like it looks like it needs to, that the left needs to drop and the right needs to come up, and it may be in reality that's the way it is, but I'm sure somebody got there and said, oh, this azalea or whatever is blooming there is so beautiful. I want to include it. I want to frame, but they're overdoing. It's too much. And so what I did is I just cropped the picture just to demonstrate, if I were there, here's what I might look to do with the falls. And again, if you want to tell the story of the plant that's on the right, take some detailed pictures of it. But the fence again gives you a different whole leading line to there. And the most important thing is waterfalls are complex enough. And so what you want to do is simplify everything else around it. You don't want to say, is this the story of the fence? Is it the story of the flowers? Is it the story of the water? What am I telling in terms of the story? So has my little crop version come up?
It did. That's really pretty.
And the other thing is it gives you that power that just in the way I cropped it, shows the difference of if you were shooting just straight up at the falls. And the story then is about that water and the rocks, and you can do some things in post. You're going to have to clean it up a little bit, because you don't want to slide in and wreck your equipment or hurt yourself at the bottom of a falls. You're going to do what you can realistically do, and maybe that was the only safe place to be, and then you can try to change things in post. And I have another example that's coming up.
It's up.
It's up. So one thing I want to say about this idea of the smooth water, and the reason I want to start with Ansel Adams, is that for me, I think sometimes this technique of doing the smooth water is overdone. Obviously in this one, it's overdone. I almost want a mermaid to come out of the middle of the pool here or something. It just, I would urge you to take your waterfall pictures at varying speeds of your shutter speeds, because you may get back home and say, I really wanted the story to be about the rushing water. I wanted, as Cece said, I wanted to feel the power, or I wanted to hear the roar. I wanted to sense the smell. But I don't know what happened in photography, but it's almost like every single waterfall picture I ever see now is this like incredibly silky smooth water, which, you know, anybody can do by slowing the shutter speed. But, and if you want to create the fantasy place with a mermaid in the middle, then sure, you know, slow the shutter speed and overplay with it in post-production. But, you know, think about, does it always have to be this silky smooth, or do you want to do realistic? And my idea is, you've made the effort of hiking in, do both, do all, play with your speeds, you know, so that later on you can say what is most appealing to you. And I have just a couple of more pictures. The next one is of water over the mossy rocks.
It's
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose it depends on what your story is about.
Other thoughts?
The cropping, once it makes me want to look further higher up into the picture. I want to see, because you see a little bit of falls or water coming off in the middle of that top part, and it just seems to be cut off, and it just looks, okay, this is about rocks, not about the water.
All right.
Yeah, exactly.
I agree, and actually, there's just no, it just doesn't seem to be any depth to that water at all. It's kind of hard to even, I mean, if we didn't know that, it could be anything.
Yeah, I think the speed is too slow, or are they in post-production blurred it up there? I think, you know, I was trying to even figure out how they got detail of a little bit of the water movement on the rocks that are lower down and no movement up there. And it,
Right,
you know, I keep looking at this. And the other thing that I know that some of this was in post-production is that the lower right shouldn't be as blurred. It should be the same almost level of detail as the left, and it's not. Again, I think if this was, you know, in a massage studio and you had, like, you know, nice flowing water in the background, it gives you a feeling of peace, and the green is really pretty. But this picture conflicts me, and I think, Jan, you're right, the cropping up top, you sort of don't know where it came from. But again, this is something a lot of people do, and I think it's a technique that's gone a little bit haywire in terms of too much. And it would be better if it was cropped a little bit lower and the green wasn't at the very bottom, if you just wanted to have this sort of silky effect on the rocks. And I really do only have two more. This is the picture that I used when I was talking about the silky, and you'll notice earlier on when the picture comes up that I had cropped out the top and just zoomed in on the detail. So when this picture comes up, you know, what's really nice about this one is the foreground elements really do add to it. The leading lines are really nice. Yeah. The top, even though it's really bright, adds sort of a little bit of mystery of into the woods.
It's
Other comments?
I think the composition is really nice, especially the waterfall.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, the foreground elements there add a lot.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep. Yep.
I think I would have moved it to the right a little bit, just a hair.
Mm-hmm.
It's close crop on the right.
Yep. To balance it a little. And again, you know, you're in an environment, you're on slippery rocks, you're going to do what you have to do, but you know, I think Missy, you're right, it's a little off balanced. Or you could even do there's not that much. You could crop it a little bit on the left in post and not lose that much, and have a little bit more balance left and right. They're tricky, you know, these are tricky to do because you're dealing with an environment that's not going to be perfect. And I sort of wonder if they went in and got a handful of leaves and put them there because I think it's set up because the leaves are too perfect, but it might have happened by accident. But you notice that the rock, the second rock back has no leaves to it. So and you know, that's perfectly okay to do, but the leaves have leading lines in. So I think somebody did take some time and set the scene a little bit. And if you notice that the leaves in the bottom right are even facing sort of the direction you'd want them to face. But look, you know, if you're doing this, if there is foreground elements, there's also no sticks there. They might have cleaned out some sticks that might have been there. You know, all depends on how much you want to do. And the very last picture is coming up, and it's more of reflections.
That's beautiful.
It is.
Yeah.
It is beautiful.
So again, it's a Getty image, but almost a bookend opposite from the Ansel Adams picture. This one, you just see the mist. Mist is so beautiful to do early in the morning, or this could be sunset. They probably did put a little bit more orange in post-production, but this gives you this feeling of tranquility and peace, whereas Ansel Adams' water was roaring and powerful. So my last slide has a few reminders on it. Everyone get ready. Next weekend, I think it's next weekend, we have super full moons that will be visible on April 26th and 27th. And if you go out and do your full moon photography this month and you learn something from it, you'll get another chance because May 26th is also a super full moon. And it's really fun to do moon rises from the drive. There's places, a lot of the fields in Clark County have really cool moonrise areas. So get ready for super moons. Next month is May the Force Be With You. We're doing a whole theme of Star Wars at the library. So my May 1st session is going to be out of this world editing techniques. There's also a presentation if you know people who are interested in photography that was done from the space station, or if you have young people who really like the whole idea of space travel. We have a really fun NASA engineer who's going to do a presentation on Thursday, May 6th at 6:30. And he's great. And he's got some awesome images of what Earthrise looked like from the space station. And that one, I'll send out the link, but if you want to go on site and sign up, and again, if you've got kids or grandkids who are interested in space travel, please have them come join us. We're also going to do a theme called The Aliens Among Us and talk about the invasive spotted lanternfly, which is a real threat to the area. And then at the end of May, we're going to do a super sharing session because we haven't done one in a while, and it can be wildflowers and other spring delights. If you get pictures of that supermoon, that would be super cool. And I will send out a link for being able to post those pictures.